If this bill passes, what could that mean for Alberta businesses? Deborah Yedlin is the president of the Calgary Chamber of Commerce. She's in Calgary. Ms. Yedlin, I wonder if you can start with an overview of what concerns you're hearing from your members about the impact of this Sovereignty Act.
What we're hearing from our members is that they're concerned about the uncertainty and the inability to attract capital that will cause us pause from an investment perspective. We compete around the world for capital and for labor, and we need to make sure that we have a stable government and legislation in place so that people can actually choose Alberta as a place to invest. When you look at it from a broader perspective, we know that there are significant opportunities from the energy transition perspective, and we need to continue to invest in that. Calgary's energy sector grew with the attraction of capital from around the world. We cannot fund the exploration development. We did not do that, and we cannot fund the energy transition by ourselves. So what we need is capital to come here and help us do that. We also need talent to help us continue to grow the economy and to continue to diversify the economy. And so the uncertainty presented by this act is what's causing businesses to be concerned.
So is it that particular area, the energy transition, to get money for green investments and transition projects, that is the primary concern, or is it a global issue?
It's not that, but it's not that, David. I mean, that's a big number when you think about what we need to spend, sort of $80 billion a year to get to 2050 net zero. That's a big part of it. But the other piece is that we need talent. We've been growing the economy in Alberta. We've been diversifying the economy in Alberta. You know, we've got ag tech, clean tech, fintech. It's quite a different place than it was even 5 years ago. But we need talent. We need people to come here, and we want to continue to see companies choosing Alberta as a place to set up a business, to establish a Canadian presence, and to grow their businesses. And so that means that we need to be seen as a favorable place to come to. And right now, this adds an element of uncertainty that people are not comfortable with.
Now, we've heard from the Deputy Premier Casey Madhu on Twitter today saying that some amendments may be considered to clarify exactly how this legislation will work, but it seems to be more the procedural questions rather than the intent, which is to challenge federal laws and maybe opt out of federal laws. If there are going to be changes to this thing, what changes would you like to see?
Well, we'd like to see the removal of the ability of cabinet to unilaterally modify or suspend provincial legislation. That would be one thing. You know, the legislature still has to vote on Bill 1, but once it's implemented, the premier and the cabinet could unilaterally suspend, modify, or add provisions to provincial legislation. That's not okay in our view. We need also definition and scope for what defines harmful in the interests of Albertans. Right now, it says the Act talks about applying anything deemed harmful to Albertans. But from our perspective, that's quite vague, and it doesn't specify what the government could view as harmful.
Right. So Premier Smith says one of the key things for this legislation is meant to put Ottawa on notice that Alberta will fight for its oil and gas sector. I mean, do you think this act accomplishes this? Will this encourage resource investment in Alberta if the government is seen to be defending that particular sector?
So I think that what we have to bear in mind is that we have to have a constructive conversation. We need to collaborate. We need to work together to find a solution to the challenges that we face. We know that the federal government has jurisdiction over infrastructure. We know that Alberta has jurisdiction over its resource development. Clearly, there's not a meeting of the minds, and there hasn't been for a while. And we acknowledge that. That has left Alberta very frustrated. But I would argue that this is a Canadian issue. This is not just an Alberta issue, because when you look at the issue of resource development, whether it's the Saguenay LNG project, whether it's Northern Gateway, whether it's other projects that have been shelved because of the length of time it took for approvals to take place, this actually has an impact on Canada's economy. And so what we really need to see is a conversation about how we develop our resources to the benefit of Canadians. And that's what's frustrated Albertans and particularly the energy sector. So I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. And let's figure out how to work together because that's what we've seen in the past. I think that when we go back to the era of Peter Lougheed, he built consensus amongst other premiers to make sure that Ottawa heard the concerns. And I think we should be thinking about going back to that approach. You
mentioned the uncertainty hampering investment. I remember Tech Frontier cited the political environment as a reason why it didn't go ahead with its big investment. But when you look at the Sovereignty Act, which says it's there to stand up for these sectors, do you think it's making the situation better, or do you think it's making the situation worse?
It's not helpful. Because when you come out with a adversarial, confrontational position, it doesn't necessarily set the table for a conversation that is set up for success. What you need is to be able to approach people in a way that is open. And I would say that this is not necessarily, this is very clearly a confrontational approach. And that doesn't necessarily invite constructive dialogue.
Right. So Environment Minister Sonia Savage, she had said in the past that international investors were worried about the act. This is while she was serving as the energy minister for Jason Kenney, a very different kind of premier. She now says all of her original concerns have been addressed in this legislation. Is that what you're hearing from potential investors? It sure doesn't sound like it based on your analysis.
When we talk to people who are in the investment community, they're concerned about what this means in terms of our ability to attract capital. As I said, we've relied on the attraction of capital to grow the industry in Alberta, and that's just as important from an energy perspective as it is from any other perspective that we're looking at to support our economic diversification. So it doesn't matter any way you look at this. If you're someone who's trying to bring investment to Alberta, if you're trying to explain risk to a board and make the case for an investment, if there's some sense that that risk has gone up, that means your cost of capital has gone up. That means you have to have different risk mitigation strategies in place. And that means that capital will potentially be allocated elsewhere. As we know, capital is mercenary. It goes to where it can get the best possible return. And if there are deemed to be barriers or extreme uncertainty, it will go somewhere else. So we don't want to see that.
So what do you do if this is passed as written? Like, I mean, there is some suggestion of change, but it seems like a clarification rather than a moving away from the core intent of what this legislation is meant to do. What do groups like the Chamber of Commerce do if Daniel Smith's government moves ahead with this?
Well, we're hoping that there will be amendments put forward when the bill's put to a vote, and that we'll see some softening of the language and the intent of the bill. As I said, I don't think it needs to be as strongly presented as it is now, and we will have to work with the government, and we'll work with with our members to make sure that we help them deal with closing some gaps as best we can. As I said, we did survey our members. We had surveys open for about 4 months, asking them what their chief concerns were with respect to being able to conduct their business. And at the top of the list was the cost of doing business, the rising inflation, the inability to get the labor that they need. While they did acknowledge that there was potentially a different approach to be taken with Ottawa, the Sovereignty Act was clearly not at the top of the list. It was far down the list. And I think that's something that we have to bear in mind. We have some very real challenges from a business standpoint in Alberta, and let's focus on those issues.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.